Hello, this is Kate Hoover and your Patton University online course instructor for this semester. I will be reading through course MBA 630, The Global Economy. So here we have Unit 1, Introduction. Since the dawn of human civilizations, people have engaged in trade. As civilizations grew and spread across the globe, international trade spread with them. The Silk Road once connected to China to Europe, for example, and many other trade routes such as that connecting Ethiopia to the Middle East, constitute examples of early international trade. Today, trade moves much more quickly thanks to technologies that have made it possible for iPhones assembled in Taiwan to be sold in Apple stores in the US. Perhaps because trade is such a central part of human history, we take it for granted that countries will trade with each other. But have you ever wondered why nations trade? Simply put, countries engage in trade in order to acquire products and materials that they may not be necessarily capable of producing themselves. And trade has an enormous impact on the global economy and individual countries' economic standing. Because so much depends on trade, there are also many ways to quantify the impact of trade on a nation and how a nation can benefit from it. So here we have 3 learning objectives. Number 1, explain the basis for trade and the impact of gains on the public and private sector. Number 2, we have evaluate how countries and organizations benefit from trade relations. And number 3, analyze the relationship between opportunity costs and comparative advantage. So for our first objective, we have our course resources. I'm going to open up Reading, Globalization, and Trade. So you open that up and we have our introduction that we're going to go through together of Chapter 1. The globalization of the world economy. The world is rapidly globalizing, and this is providing many opportunities and major challenges to the nations and people of the world. We begin our study of international economics with a brief overview of the globalization revolution taking place in the world today. We live in a global economy. We live in a globalized world. We can connect instantly with any corner of the world by cellular phone, email, instant messaging, and teleconferencing, and we can travel anywhere incredibly fast. Tastes are converging, i.e., more and more people all over the world generally like the same things. And many goods we consume are either made abroad or have many imported parts and components. Many of the services we use are increasingly provided by foreigners as, for example, when a radiography taken in a New York hospital is evaluated across the world in Bangalore, India, and when H&R Block sends our tax returns abroad for processing. Even small companies that until a few decades ago faced only local or regional competition now must compete with firms from across the globe. Although not as free as the flow of international trade in goods and services, millions of workers at all skill levels have migrated around the world, and thousands of jobs have moved from advanced countries to such emerging markets as India and China. Finance has also globalized. We can invest in companies anywhere in the world and purchase financial instruments such as stocks and bonds from any company, from almost anywhere in the world. Many pension funds are in fact invested abroad, and a financial crisis in one financial center quickly spreads across the world at the click of a mouse. We can exchange dollars for euros and most other currencies easily and quickly. But the rates at which we exchange our currency often change frequently and drastically. In short, tastes, production, competition, labor markets, and financial markets are rapidly globalizing. And this affects all of us deeply as consumers, workers, investors, and voters. Yes, we live in a global economy. So now we have our case study 1.1. The Dell PCs, iPhones, and iPads sold in the United States are anything but American. So you guys can go ahead and read through that. We also have a table about specific parts and components of the Dell company. And then we have our next case study, 1.2, what is an American car? and now we're on to section 1.1b, the globalization challenge. Globalization is a revelation which, in terms of scope and significance, is comparable to the Industrial Revolution, but whereas the Industrial Revolution took place over a century, today's global revolution is taking place under our very eyes in a decade or two. Globalization, of course, is not new. Roman coins circulated throughout the empire 2,000 years ago. Chinese currency was used in China even earlier. More recently, the world has experienced three periods of rapid globalization: 1870 to 1914, 1945 to 1980, and 1980 to the present. Globalization in 1870 to 1914 resulted from the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the opening of a new resource-rich but sparsely populated lands in North America, South America, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. These lands received millions of immigrants and vast amounts of foreign investments, principally from England, to open up new lands to food and raw material production. These so-called regions of recent settlement grew rapidly during this period by exporting increasing amounts of food and raw materials to Europe in exchange for manufactured goods. This period of modern globalization came to an end with the breakout of World War I in 1914. The second period of rapid globalization started with the end of World War II in 1945 and extended to about 1980. It was characterized by the rapid increase of international trade as a result of the dismantling of the heavy trade protection that had been put in place during the Great Depression that started in the U.S. in 1929 and during World War II. What is different about the present globalization revolution is its speed, depth, and immediacy resulting from the tremendous improvements in telecommunications and transportation, massive international capital flows, resulting from elimination of most restrictions on their flow across national boundaries, as well as by the participation of most countries of the world. This is what makes today's globalization that much more pervasive and dramatic than earlier periods of globalization. The recent global financial and economic crisis, the deepest of the post-war period, only slowed down the march of globalization temporarily. As all revolutions, however, today's globalization brings many benefits and advantages, but also has some disadvantages or harmful side effects. In fact, there is a great deal of disagreement as to the extent and type of advantages and disadvantages. Does getting cheaper and or better products and service from abroad justify sacrificing domestic jobs? Why are some people in some countries very rich and obese while others are dismally poor and starving? Although labor migration generally leads to the more efficient utilization of labor, it also leads to job losses and lower wages for less skilled labor in advanced nations and harms the nations of immigration. Similarly, financial globalization and unrestricted capital flows lead to more efficient use of capital throughout the world, as well as provide opportunities for higher returns and risk diversification for individuals and corporations. But they also seem to lead to periodic international financial crises, such as the one that started in Asia in 1997 and affected most other developing countries, and the subprime housing mortgage crisis that started in the United States in 2007 and affected the entire world in 2008 and 2009. Finally, are we running out of resources such as petroleum, other minerals, water? Is the world headed for a climate disaster? These disadvantages and negative aspects of globalization have given rise to a rethinking of the old age belief in free trade and to a strong anti-globalization movement, which blames globalization for many humans and environmental problems throughout our world, and for sacrificing human and environmental well-being to the corporate profits of multinationals. Globalization is being blamed for world poverty and child labor in poor countries, job losses and lower wages in rich countries, as well as environmental pollution and climate change throughout the world. Although there is some truth in these accusations, an in-depth economic analysis will show that often the primary cause of many of the serious problems facing the world today lies elsewhere. Globalization has many social, political, legal, and ethical aspects, and so economists need to work closely with other social and physical scientists as well as with the entire civil society to give globalization a more human face. Globalization is important because it increases efficiency in the production of material things. It is inevitable because we cannot run or hide away from it. Globalization is important because it increases efficiency in the production of material things. It is inevitable because we cannot hide or run away from it. But we would like globalization also to be sustainable and humanizing and ultimately fair. This requires a profound change in world governance. Such is the challenge facing humanity today and in this decade. All these topics and many more are either directly or indirectly the subject matter of international economics that are covered in this text. So that is a good section of our first reading, Globalization and Trade. We now have a video that you guys can watch called The Silk Road and Ancient Trade. And then we have an external page that you guys can also go ahead and read called China's GDP Growth Less Than Meets the Eye. And then finally we have an activity of flashcards that you guys can go over. So that concludes Objective 1. So now we are on Objective 2, and we are going to go to Course Resources and open up the first reading, Benefits of Trade Relations. So this is Chapter 2, the Law of Comparative Advantage, and we are just going to read through the introduction together. In this chapter, we examine the development of trade theory from the 17th century through the first part of the 20th century. This historical approach is useful not because we are interested in the history of economic thought as such, but because it is a convenient way of introducing the concepts and theories of international trade from the simple to the more complex and realistic. The basic questions that we seek to answer in this chapter are: Number 1, what is the basis for trade and what are the gains from trade? Presumably, a nation will voluntarily engage in trade only if it benefits from trade. But how are gains from trade generated? How large are the gains and how are they divided among the trading nations? And then number 2, what is the pattern of trade? That is, what commodities are traded and which commodities are exported and imported by each nation. We begin with a brief discussion of the economic doctrines known as mercantilism that prevailed during the 17th and 18th centuries. Then we go on to discuss the theory of absolute advantage developed by Adam Smith. It remained, however, for David Ricardo, writing some 40 years after Smith, to truly explain the pattern of and the gains from trade with his law of comparative advantage. The law of comparative advantage is one of the most important laws of economics, with applicability to nations as well as to individuals, and useful for exposing many serious fallacies in apparently logical reasoning. One difficulty remained. Ricardo had based his explanation of the law of comparative advantage on the labor theory of value, which was subsequently rejected. In the first part of the 20th century, Gottfried Haberler came to Ricardo's rescue by explaining the law of comparative advantage in terms of the opportunity cost theory, as reflected in production possibility frontiers or transformation curves. For simplicity, our discussion will initially refer to only 2 nations and 2 commodities. In the appendix to this chapter, the conclusions will be generalized to trade in more than 2 commodities and among more than 2 nations. It must also be pointed out that while comparative advantage is the cornerstone of international trade theory, trade can also be based on other reasons, such as economies of large-scale production and product differentiation. These are examined in Chapter 6. Furthermore, the comparative advantage of nations can change over time, especially as a result of technological change, as explained in Chapter 7. So you can go on to continue to read that section. If we go back to Objective 2, Course Resources, After the reading, we have an external page called Europe's Week Ahead, Economic Funk to Continue. So you can go ahead and watch that video. And then our next external page called The Global Economy is Counting on a U.S.-Europe Trade Deal. We can open that and we're going to read part of that together. Okay. Our international leaders are finally getting serious about global free trade, and not a moment too soon. Earlier this month, the United States and the European Union began to talk on trade, almost 2 years of preparation. Establishing a U.S.-Europe free trade agreement is crucial for the global economy and will strengthen businesses of all sizes, opening up the global market to competition and innovation. Trade between the United States and the European Union countries now accounts for almost half of global economic output. The 28 member states of the European Union are by far our biggest trading partner. If the transatlantic trade and investment partnership comes to fruition, it will be the biggest trade agreement in history. Establishing this free trade agreement could add $420 billion per year to the global economy and create some 2 million jobs. Sadly, negotiations have been a long time coming, with what sensitive areas like our own Buy American initiatives and Europe's aversion to genetically modified crops. 2 other big areas of contention and financial regulations, and France's film industry protections, and the recent revelations about the United States eavesdropping PRISM program may have started the U.S. on a weak footing. Under current trade laws, tariffs between the U.S. and the European Union are relatively low, less than 3% on average, but both sides impose formidable non-tariff barriers. These barriers improve custom procedures and behind-borders regulatory restrictions. Free trade negotiations aim to eliminate tariffs together and to slice NTBs. Eliminating tariffs and cutting NTBs by just 25% could boost the U.S. GDP by 0.8%, according to the UK-based research. Strong trade relations with Europe could boost U.S. and European Union economic growth by more than $100 billion annually. In other words, free trade could be just the jump our economy needs to accelerate recovery, not just in the U.S., but globally. In particular, a free trade agreement would boost competition and strengthen businesses, especially small businesses. According to the 2013 Small Business Exporting Survey, these businesses accounted for 98% of exporting firms and 33% of exporting value in the U.S., yet 69% of these businesses struggle with international trade due to foreign restrictions. Free trade would offer expanded markets for their products, the ability to import raw material, a less burdensome regulatory environment to allow for innovation, and a more streamlined process for customs, licensing, and inspection. Businesses in the tech sector especially would benefit from a free trade agreement in the European Union. According to Tech America, computer electronics products accounted for $59.5 billion in trade between the United States and the European Union in 2012. As I have written before, free trade eliminates barriers in innovation and lowers the cost of raw material for startups, which in turn gives consumers access to low-cost electronics. Removing government barriers to trade will necessarily expose businesses to fiercer competition, but it will also remove regulatory hurdles now imposed by governments. Granted, competition has to result in winners and losers, but this will strengthen the economy and force businesses to prove they can compete on a fair and level playing field. Those businesses that can compete in the global arena will be the stronger for it. Competition is the backbone of a free market economy, but no business of any size should have to compete in an international arena that picks winners and losers through burdensome and inconsistent regulations. The U.S. and European Union hope to reach a finalized agreement by November 2014. The deadline is tight and many significant issues will have to be worked through. We can only hope leaders of all involved nations will be able to work out a deal. It will take compromise and open-mindedness on all sides, but it can and must be done. Our global economy is counting on it. So that concludes our second external page. In our course resources, next we have an activity flashcards that you guys can complete. And then finally we have a reading of questions about trade relations. So you can also go ahead and read through those questions. And that concludes Objective 2. So finally we have reached Objective 3. If you open up Objective 3 and go to Course Resources, we can open up the first reading together called The Standard Theory of International Trade. So you can open that. So this is Chapter 3, The Standard Theory of International Trade. So we are just going to read through part of the introduction and a little bit of the first part of the reading. This chapter extends our simple trade model to the more realistic case of increasing opportunity costs. Tastes or demand preferences are introduced with community indifference curves. We then see how these forces of supply and demand determine the equilibrium relative commodity price in each nation in the absence of trade under increasing costs. This will also indicate the commodity of comparative advantage for each nation. Subsequently, we examine how, with trade, each nation gains by specializing in the production of the commodity of its comparative advantage and exporting some of its output in exchange for the commodity of its comparative disadvantage. The last section of the chapter shows how mutually beneficial trade is possible even when two nations are exactly alike, except for tastes under increasing cost conditions. In this and the following chapters, it will be convenient to generalize the presentation and deal with Nation 1 and 2 and commodity X and Y, as opposed to examples of wheat and cloth. The appendix to this chapter is a review of those aspects of production theory that are essential for understanding the material presented in the appendices of the chapters that follow. This and the subsequent appendices can be omitted without loss of continuity in the text. So now we're on 3.2, the production frontier with increasing costs. It is more realistic for a nation to face increasing rather than constant opportunity costs. Increasing opportunity costs mean that the nation must give up more and more of one commodity to release just enough resources to produce each additional unit of another commodity. Increasing opportunity costs result in a production frontier that is concave from the origin, rather than a straight line. 3.2, illustration of increasing costs. So figure 3.1 shows the hypothetical production frontier of commodities X and Y for Nation 1 and 2. Suppose that Nation 1 wants to produce more of commodity X starting from point A on its production frontier. Since at point A the nation is already utilizing all of its resources with the best technology available, the nation can only produce more of X by reducing the output of commodity Y. The increasing opportunity costs in terms of Y that Nation 1 faces are reflected in the longer and longer downward arrows in the figure and result in a production frontier that is concave from the origin. Nation 1 also faces increasing opportunity costs in the production of Y. This could be demonstrated graphically by showing that Nation 1 has to give up increasing amounts of X for each additional batch of 20Y that it produces. However, instead of showing that for Nation 1 we demonstrate increasing opportunity costs in the production of Y with the production frontier of Nation 2 in figure 3.1. Moving upward from point A, along the production frontier of Nation 2, we observe leftward arrows of increasing length reflecting the increasing amounts of X that Nation 2 must give up to produce each additional batch of 20Y. Thus, concave production frontiers for Nation 1 and 2 reflect increasing opportunity costs in each nation in the production of both commodities. (3.2c) Reasons for increasing opportunity costs and different production frontiers. We've examined the meaning of increasing opportunity costs as reflected in concave production frontiers. But how do increasing opportunity costs arise, and why are they more realistic than constant opportunity costs? Increasing opportunity costs arise because resources or factors of production are not used in the same fixed proportion or intensity in the production of all commodities. This means that as the nation produces more of a commodity, it must utilize resources that become progressively less efficient or less suited for the production of that commodity. As a result, the nation must give up more and more of the second commodity to release just enough resources to produce each additional unit of the first commodity. For example, suppose some of a nation's land is flat and suited for growing wheat, and some is hilly and better suited for grazing and milk production. The nation originally specialized in wheat, but now wants to concentrate on producing milk. By transferring its hilly areas from wheat growing to grazing, the nation gives up very little wheat and obtains a great deal of milk. Thus, the opportunity cost of milk in terms of the amount of wheat given up is initially small. But if this transfer process continues, eventually flat land, which is better suited for wheat growing, will have to be used for grazing. As a result, the opportunity cost of milk will rise and the production frontier will be concave from the origin. The difference in the production frontiers of Nation 1 and Nation 2 in Figure 3.1 is due to the fact that two nations have different factor endowments or resources at their disposal, and/or use different technologies in production. In the real world, production frontiers or different nations will usually differ, since practicality, no two nations have identical factor endowments, even if they could have access to the same technology. As the supply or availability of factors and/or technology changes over time, a nation's production frontier shifts. The type and extent of these shifts depend on the type and extent of the changes that take place. These changes are examined in detail in Chapter 7, which deals with economic growth and its effect on international trade. So we're going to stop there. You can continue reading that section. If we go back to Objective 3, our course resources. Let's see. After the first reading, we have a video on opportunity cost. So you guys can go ahead and watch that. Next, we have another video on comparative advantage, specialization, and gains from trade. So you guys can go ahead and read that one also. Finally, we have an activity of flashcards that would be really helpful in reviewing all this information. And then last, we have reading problems on comparative advantage. So that concludes the information